Hello everyone, I'm Pierre from Steps, and you're listening to our podcast series, Steps in Conversation With. Today I'm joined remotely by Sian Richardson to talk about skills practice sessions. Thanks Sian for joining. So let's start with the basics. Can you tell me a bit about yourself?
Yes, hello. Hi there, Pierre. So I've been working with Steps for, goodness me, I want to say 25 years, but I've got a horrible feeling it might even be longer than that. I'm only saying horrible feeling because it shows my age. I wasn't a child when I started working for them. But during that time, I've been both an actor, a facilitator, trainer, writer and designer of programs, and a coach.
So you've worked a lot with us on delivering skills practice sessions.
Yeah.
What was your experience in delivering virtual sessions before the pandemic?
To be honest, I had done some virtual online skills practice before, but it was very, very minor. So my experience before was very much in the room, small groups, getting them to choose either bespoke situations that they wanted to try out, where, they explained the situation, gave me the characterizations of the individual they wanted me to be, and we would play that out and then move on to the next person with feedback in between. So doing that online initially was a little bit scary because, of course, you're diving into the unknown.
And how was this unknown like? Because suddenly everything became 100% virtual.
Yeah.
How was it for you?
If I'm honest, I was less worried about the content and the delivery because I do feel that Steps do this incredibly well, and they always give us, the facilitators, the trainers, the actors, all the skills and material that we need to make sure that we're a success. I think the fear was more around the technology, things like what happens if you drop out, what happens if a participant drops out. But very quickly, I think we learned how to get round those things. Whoever knew, for instance, that you could tether your phone to your internet, an expression I never thought I'd hear myself say. And also, it didn't matter. If you lost somebody, it's fine. They just called back in. And I think that's one of the joys about working online. It has a kind of casual, relaxed feel to it. And I really do think that improves the learning.
Mm-hmm. And are there any other aspects that you've discovered during this period? What are your key takeaway elements?
Okay, so a couple of things really. One is I feel that when you're working online, you need to be much more explicit than you are in the room. You have to say everything. And I've had experiences recently where I might have forgotten to say something. You can't expect the audience sitting in the comforts of their front rooms or their kitchens to be able to mind me what's going on. Somehow in the room, people get a sense of what's going on, but when they're all individually sat in different spaces, they don't. So really explicit, tell them exactly what's going on and what they need to be aware of. The other thing that I found is people, because they are at home, I think feel more relaxed. There isn't that sense of I'm in the workplace, I'm in front of colleagues, oh my goodness, what if I make a mistake? Now that could be also because of the functionality of being able to turn your camera off when the other person is doing the role play. So as we are now, I know other people can't see us, but Pierre and I are talking on Zoom. It's just the two of us. We could be the only people in the world. And so all of your colleagues they've disappeared from on site, from on screen. And I think people forget they're there. So they're much more eager to jump in, have a go and make mistakes. I think there's something about the time pressure as well. Having 90 minutes means people are absolutely super focused on the job in hand. I've never had, touch wood, a participant say, I don't want to do it. Whereas in the room, we very often get participants saying, oh, I haven't got a situation I want to try out, or I'd really rather not. They just throw themselves in. And another reason that might be is a lot of the conversations that we're trying out through skills practice are conversations people need to have via digital platforms. So what best way to practice than actually being on one and having that experience of knowing where to look, how to use the camera. It just works so well.
And speaking of these new conversations that we're all having right now, what are the skills that employees or managers need to develop?
I think, okay, I'll give you an example, best illustrated by an example. This happened just yesterday. I was working with a lovely colleague, participant, I suppose that she did become a colleague through the time we were together, and she was delivering a courageous conversation. And during that courageous conversation, she had a format to follow. So a model, if you like, to follow that she'd been given the day before. So what tended to happen, and I completely understand why she was doing this, she had a written script, she was slightly turned to one side and her focus was down the whole time. So what this meant for me, playing the person that she was having the courageous conversation with, is that I felt she wasn't engaged in the conversation at all. But we only got to that once I said to her, do you know what? Rather than worry too much about what you've written on the paper, just look at me or look straight through the camera and just tell me what you'd really like to say. And it made the world of difference. It really did. Suddenly she was connecting with me as she would in the room. So I think that's a real learning. There's a real learning there about you still need to maintain that eye contact, particularly as you've got kind of shoulders up. So there isn't a lot of the other body language that you can use when you're sat in the room with someone. And facial expressions become incredibly important.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because now that we're virtual on camera, it feels really different. It feels much more intimate, and we're much closer. So my experience is that I read body language differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some other thoughts around that, aren't there? There are some thoughts around, again, you've got this screen, you can sometimes forget that people are seeing everything. So being very mindful about those expressions of raising your eyes or looking bored, they're magnified on screen. So again, for participants, I think it's them being really focused and remembering that at any moment the facilitator could be zooming in, excuse the expression or the pun, onto them. And likewise, as a facilitator, if you're on screen, you've got to use as much energy, I think, as in the room. Because if you just go neutral, it looks like you've either zoned out or you've got an internet connection problem and you've gone frozen for those few moments.
Speaking of the facilitators, you mentioned that you need to be more energetic and be very clear in your instructions. Are there any other aspects or skills that you had to develop?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think there's something about when you're on, I was going to say on stage, but I guess when you're in the room, it is a little bit like being on stage, isn't it? You go into that kind of performance mode because you're standing up, you're in front of an audience, they're all sat down. So already you've got you're higher in your status because you're standing than they are because they're sat. And it's almost like, okay, we're starting the session and you go into that kind of performance mode. I think that's very different on screen. Something I've developed is a much more casual, friendly approach. So that bit when people come into the room, just chatting to them about how their day's been, how they're feeling, maybe mentioning things that are positive about their background. I think people get very scared. They get scared about things like the cat moving across the screen or the dog barking in the background. So I make people feel comfortable by saying, oh, that's great. Who's joining us today? Or let's have a look at your cat. Or don't worry at all about children in the background. They make for a much more interesting conversation on Zoom. So making people know that all of that's okay.
Yeah, it really sounds like real life situations.
Exactly. I think if you don't let people know that we're all in this together and we understand that we're not in the office and you've got outside things going on, people are going to just sit there worrying rather than focusing on the learning.
And what feedback do you get from the participants? How do they feel about the virtual setting?
Well, I think that's been the biggest surprise, is that I was really expecting people to say, yeah, it's not quite like in the room though, is it? But people haven't said that. They love it. They really love it. And I remember one of the very early days of doing virtual training, somebody wrote in the chat, this is even better than being in the room. And I'm not quite sure what that was about. Maybe it was about he was a particular introverted individual. He didn't feel picked on. He felt that he could put his ideas in the chat rather than have to say it out loud. And I think that that has been a real learning. People also say it's really realistic. And to add to that, I feel in the acting, you've almost got to play it even higher. Strangely, because on TV, we know that you turn the volume down and you're smaller in the behaviors that you exhibit. But I think online, they almost have to be bigger because people are concentrating on all those other things that might be going on in the house around them.
So now, after almost a year of virtual sessions, what would be your recommendations for this kind of programs?
I think less is more. And I really mean that. I think when you're putting a program together to deliver online, don't try and over jam it with everything. I also really love the fact that because they are shorter sessions, we can divide them up into different days. So, for instance, I did a feedback session recently where day one or session one was just looking at the model and talking about what feedback is, when it works, when it doesn't work. Then we had a couple of weeks in between, came back, and then we practiced the feedback. And I thought that was so much better. I've had a feeling about this for a while, even when we're in the room, that sometimes we try and do too much. So it's the end of the day by the time we're asking people to put these things into practice. And by that time, they're just exhausted. So I love that we have the ability to give these short, sharp sessions where people can really digest the learning in between.
But tell me, I'm sure there are a few things that you're missing from being in the room.
Yeah, I am, strangely, and I'm sure my colleagues won't thank me for this, but I actually miss the travel. I don't miss having to disappear on a Sunday afternoon to travel somewhere for a Monday, but I really miss just getting on that train and knowing I'm going somewhere else. Variety is the spice of life. And I think that's what keeps us going in this business, is that we like to dip into different people's worlds and see where they work and what their life looks like. Coming into my dining room every day isn't quite the same. And I also miss colleagues. I miss the chat. Participants often say to us what they miss are those kind of off the cuff water cooler chats where you obviously have quite a lot of not just bonding, but you can talk about some quite important things in the workplace that you don't always have time for. And I think it's the same with us. Us being the Steps colleagues, we miss that interaction of being able to say, how's it going? Or how did you like how I did that? Or well done for that bit. You don't have that encouragement and that camaraderie necessarily online as you do in the room.
Sian, thank you so much for your time and everything that you shared today with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.